You think you know pain. Imagine cold metal pressed against the most fragile part of your body. No mercy, no medicine, only the promise of survival if you don't bleed to death. Castration wasn't rare, it was ritual. It was politics. It was an empire. And for thousands, it wasn't just the body destroyed, it was the soul. For centuries, empires across the world turned castration into a weapon of loyalty, of punishment, of faith. It was never just mutilation. It was transformation, often into something less than human. Tonight, we begin with the East, where the silence of eunuchs whispered louder than screams. History isn't dead, it's just buried beneath silence. Like, share, comment and subscribe if you're ready to keep digging with us. But be warned, some truths bite back. The silent eunuchs of the East, in the heart of imperial China, silence ruled the palace. Behind golden screens and perfumed chambers, the most trusted servants were men who were no longer men at all. Eunuchs, thousands of them, moved like shadows, voiceless and obedient, their loyalty carved into their flesh with a single brutal cut. But becoming one was not noble. It was agony. The procedure began with forced stillness. A boy, sometimes barely 12, was pinned down by men twice his size. His face was pressed to the dirt floor or against the cold stone of a chamber wall. To dull the terror, he was forced to gulp raw wine or chew a ball of opium until his tongue went numb. But no drug could numb what came next. The knife was no surgeon's tool. It was a shard of bronze, sometimes iron, sharpened on stone, and wiped once across a sleeve already stained with dried blood. In one swift, unhesitating motion, both penis and testicles were severed together, the entire root of manhood torn away. Screams echoed in narrow halls, bouncing against lacquered wood, until they collapsed into gasps. Then came the smell, thick and unforgettable. Boiling oil was poured into the open wound to stop the bleeding. The hiss of searing flesh filled the chamber. Some vomited from the stench before their bodies even gave out. Many never stood again. They bled into the floor, eyes wide, breath rattling, and died before sunrise. But those who survived, they lived another kind of death. They walked the palace forever, haunted by infections that rotted slowly from within. They were mocked as half-men, cursed to carry their shame in secret jars where their severed organs were kept, proof of their loyalty. And yet here lies the darkest irony. Some parents volunteered their sons for this fate. Poverty drove fathers to trade their children's flesh for the promise of power. A eunuch in the emperor's court could climb higher than any farmer ever dreamed. Families sacrificed their bloodline in the hope that one broken boy could lift them out of hunger. Imagine it, the choice not made in rage or punishment, but willingly calculated, deliberate, a parent's betrayal dressed as ambition. The horror wasn't just the cut. It was the silence after, when the boy realized his family had traded his body for their future. And while China turned mutilation into loyalty, another empire far to the west saw in castration a punishment worse than death, a way not just to silence men, but to erase them completely. Rome's curse of the Castrati. Rome loved order, Rome loved spectacle, and sometimes Rome stitched those two loves together with a knife. In the shadow of its marble temples, punishment had to be seen to work. A thief could lose a hand, a traitor could lose his head, but the man who dishonored a patron, defied a master, or insulted a powerful household might lose something that would follow him forever. Castration was the sentence you carried like a brand under the skin. It said, "You will live, but never as yourself again." There was no quiet room for it. Slaves were dragged to courtyards. Prisoners were pinned against stone. Wine was poured down their throats, not to comfort but to keep them from biting off their tongues when the blade bit. An iron held over coals glowed the color of sunset. The smell reached first, then the pain arrived like an animal. Teeth bared, impossible to understand and impossible to stop. Some operations were sloppy, done by men paid to be fast, not careful. Wounds tore jagged, skin burned, and infection came like a second sentence. Days later, skin hot, breath sour, and a fever that felt like drowning from the inside. Those who lived were marched back into life as a lesson. Their bodies told the crowd what Rome wanted everyone to know. The state can take anything. Yet Rome had another use for the cut. Performance. Boys were taken young, their voices trapped in a strange, ringing brightness that never fell. They were dressed in white, trained to sing like angels, and sold to households and temples that prized purity more than mercy. People clapped, people wept, people forgot what had been stolen to make that voice possible. It was entertainment built from absence, and the irony did not stop there. In the homes of the rich, eunuchs served as trusted attendants, quiet, precise, invisible. They carried secrets from bedroom to banquet hall and learned to move without sound. Loyalty wasn't paid for, it was manufactured. Rome cut desire from the body and then demanded devotion from what remained. Not every act of mutilation belonged to the law. There were private revenges, jealous husbands, and furious masters. A rumor could be a sentence. A glance could become a lifetime. The victim woke up smaller than the world around him, and the city that called itself eternal looked taller, colder, and safer because he had been made small. Rome pretended this was order. It was control dressed as virtue, and when the crowds cheered a high, clear voice rising in a temple, no one asked why the singer never grew into a man. The music soared, the truth bled quietly, far from the stage. Rome carved obedience into the flesh hand, then asked the mutilated to sing praise for the knife, a hymn that would echo long after the last note died. The Martyrs of Faith. Faith was meant to save the soul. But in medieval Europe, faith often demanded blood first, and sometimes the blood was spilled not from the battlefield, but from the body of a man kneeling in prayer. Religious devotion could warp into something grotesque. For certain sects, lust was a sin so poisonous it had to be cut out at the root. Some monks, trembling in the flicker of candlelight, gripped blades with shaking hands. Their lips whispered verses, their eyes stared into heaven, but their flesh knew only terror. With one movement, they sacrificed their manhood on the altar of purity. The stone floors of monasteries held not just prayers but stains that never washed away. But it wasn't always voluntary. The church and the law walked hand in hand, and the punishment for adultery, rape, or heresy could be a sentence far crueler than death. Men accused of sin were dragged before their villagers. The crowd was summoned, the neighbors, wives, and children, to watch justice unfold. Executioners did not use precision. They used heated blades, glowing red, pressed against living skin until it split and seared. Sometimes they used stones, crushing and pulping, ensuring there would be no recovery, no hope of healing. The crowd roared approval or jeered mockery, the spectacle burning itself into memory. This is what happens when you defy God. Survival was rare and often worse than death. Infection bloomed fast, flesh blackened, fever stole the mind. For those who lived, life meant exile, shunned by church and neighbor alike, cursed as unclean, condemned as broken vessels. The very faith that demanded the sacrifice also spat the survivors out. The tale of Origen of Alexandria haunted Christendom for centuries. One of the early church's most brilliant thinkers, tormented by guilt over lust, is said to have taken the knife to himself. His writings survived, but his body carried the wound of faith's cruelest demand. His story was told in whispers, a warning, a legend, and a reminder of how far zeal can push a soul. Religion painted castration as purification, but what it truly gave was silence, men stripped of voice, community, and worth, a soul supposedly cleansed, yet left hollow, mutilated, and alone. In Europe's Dark Age, mutilation became a sermon sharper than words, and every scream in a courtyard reminded the crowd that salvation was not only about heaven, it was about control, written in flesh, delivered with fire. But while Europe branded men with God's punishment, another empire was turning castration into something far colder, a business. For in the Ottoman world, blood itself became currency, and boys were carved not for sin, but for profit. The slave markets of blood in the Ottoman world. Castration was not a punishment. It was not a ritual of faith. It was business, bloody, calculated, and profitable. Across Africa, boys were torn from their villages, marched for weeks under the sun, their wrists rubbed raw by rope, and their bellies hollow from hunger. When they reached the hands of traders, their fates were sealed. They weren't sold whole. They were sold, altered, and that alteration required the knife. The procedure was terrifying in its completeness. Where other cultures sometimes spared part of the anatomy, here everything was taken, penis and testicles alike removed in one merciless stroke. The boys were laid on mats in filthy courtyards, their cries muffled by hands or ignored by men who had heard it too many times. There was no doctor. The surgeons were often Coptic Christians, caught in a cruel economy of survival, perfecting a craft that ended more lives than it saved. To stop the bleeding, wounds were stuffed with ash or cauterized with burning metal. Infection swept through almost immediately, the smell of rot clinging to every chamber where the cutting was done. The survival rate was a coin toss at best. Some records whisper that 9 out of 10 boys never rose again. Their small bodies were tossed into shallow graves, their screams lost to dust. But the one who survived that boy was worth a fortune. Eunuchs were in demand, especially as harem guards. Their mutilation made them safe, stripped of the ability to father children, stripped of temptation. Behind jeweled gates and silken curtains, they patrolled with hollow eyes, protecting women they could never touch, serving masters who owned both their bodies and their silence. The survivors carried scars deeper than flesh. They walked bent from chronic pain, leaked urine uncontrollably, or lived with fevers that never fully left. Their voices, stuck high and hollow, betrayed them at every word. Yet in the empire's grand palaces, they became essential keepers of secrets, trusted intermediaries, and the invisible spine of power. It was a grotesque contradiction. The same empire that treasured opulent art, towering mosques, and dazzling courts also demanded rivers of blood to fuel its order. Families were torn apart, children buried by the dozen, all to ensure that behind one gilded door, silence reigned. In markets, eunuchs fetched higher prices than healthy men. Their suffering became an economic calculation, their lives reduced to numbers on a ledger. Every scream, every death, every mutilation fed an empire that believed prosperity was worth any cruelty. And when the knife fell silent, what remained was not just a broken body but a living emblem of profit carved from pain. Yet if the Ottomans made castration a marketplace, another land across the sea turned it into a ritual. In India, it wasn't profit or punishment driving the blade. It was identity itself, rebirth written in blood. The ritual of the Hijra in South Asia, castration, carried a different shadow. Here, in the secret lives of the Hijra community, the blade was not only destruction, it was transformation. A ceremony of rebirth known as Nirvan promised a new identity, but the price was written in agony. The ritual was not performed by doctors, nor sanctioned by kings. It happened in hidden rooms, often by lamplight, where walls soaked in incense tried to mask the metallic temps of blood. A senior Hijra, revered like a priestess, held the blade. It could be a simple razor, a shard of glass, or a kitchen knife, tools not chosen for safety, but for immediacy. The initiate, trembling, was told to prepare with fasting and prayer. Cloth was wound tight around the organ to stop blood flow, the skin swelling purple as circulation died. And then, without anesthesia, without pause, the knife carved away both penis and testicles in a single brutal cut. The body screamed before the lips did. Pain lit up the spine like fire. Boiling oil, turmeric, or herbal ash was poured directly onto the wound, burning like acid, meant to stop bleeding and infection. The chants of the community filled the chamber, rising higher as the initiate thrashed, half in ritual ecstasy, half in terror. Survival was never guaranteed. Many bled out within hours, their rebirth ending in silence before it could begin. The dead were mourned quietly, buried as martyrs of identity. But those who endured, they emerged transformed, not just in body but in belonging. They were no longer trapped between worlds. They had crossed over into the Hijra lineage, a chosen family that offered them status, reverence, and purpose denied by the outside world. For outsiders, the act was incomprehensible barbaric mutilation. For insiders, it was transcendence. To bleed was to shed the old self, to burn was to awaken, and to lose was to finally gain. It was horror wrapped in sanctity and sanctity soaked in horror, yet beneath the chants and incense. The same truth whispered through every civilization we've seen. Castration was never only about the body, it was about control. In China, it created loyal servants. In Rome, it made punishment eternal. In Europe, it was purified through fear. In the Ottoman world, it lined the pockets of empires. And in India, it carved identity with blood. 7 methods, 7 worlds, 7 faces of the same blade. Humanity kept finding reasons to sever, to silence, to reshape flesh as if manhood itself were a threat that had to be cut away. The horror lies not just in the knife, but in the mind that wielded it. For every empire, every sect, every ritual, the cut was never the end. It was the beginning of obedience, of humiliation, of profit, of rebirth. And as you sit in the quiet after hearing their screams echo through time, you have to ask, what is more terrifying, the blade itself, or the human will that kept sharpening it? If this story left a mark, imagine what's coming next. Subscribe for more disturbing tales, forgotten deaths, and the grotesque truths history tried to bury. Because the past doesn't sleep, and neither should we.